Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast. It's a little bit after 12 o'clock. Nice to see all of you. We're back with another Three Ring Circus webinar that we do on a fairly regular basis for all of our past boot camp attendees. So many of you have we've had the privilege to obviously meet in person, and lately so many virtually as well, as we're doing these now virtually every 6 weeks or so. So we have gotten a ton of questions over the last, I don't know, about the last year, especially on podcasting. How do I start a podcast? What's the best approach for a podcast? What are the best questions to ask? What network should I go? Everything you can think of, from technical to content to how to create it to how to market it. And we're answering those questions today. So along with me is Connor Trombley from our team, who many of you know. He is responsible for so many things we do, from all this great technology here in the studio we're using today, through managing our podcast side of our business, and just an all-around expert in so many great marketing related items. So with that, welcome, Connor. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're going to kick it off with some questions. Of course, we'll take some time throughout our hour together to answer your questions as well. So, first out, when someone's starting out in thinking about doing a podcast, what are a couple key questions they should be asking themselves as they're kind of going through the decision making process of, do I want to start a podcast, or maybe this isn't for me?
Yeah, for sure. So there's really two core questions that I would be asking myself. The first one being, what is my why? And when it comes to podcasting, it's more of a long-term game. It's not kind of a get in and raise a million listeners, but more so something that you build over time. And so with any new venture, you're going to want to establish your North Star of exactly what does success look like? Why am I doing this in the first place? For example, it could be, I want to grow my platform. I want to grow my audience. I want to drive numbers on social media. It might be a revenue side of things, of driving revenue via affiliate marketing or via sponsorships. The second question that I would ask myself is, who is my podcast for? And this really dials into the question of, who are those core listeners? Without understanding who the target audience is, it's going to be really difficult to understand how you actually bring those listeners to your show in the first
Mm.
place. So identifying who the listeners are, establishing your why is going to be the first two questions that I would ask.
Awesome. Yeah, I think those are great. And you mentioned a little bit, but like, what are some, of course, some good reasons beyond maybe what you mentioned to start a podcast? And then, do you ever hear any reasons that, like, people start a podcast, they say, "Oh, I'm starting a podcast because of X," and we're just like, no, that's just not a good reason to go down the podcast route. I'd love it if you could share a couple of those.
Yeah, for sure. So the first one on the good reasons side of things,
Hmm.
and in no particular order. The first one being convenience, not so much for you, but for your audience, for your loyal fans. As podcasting is really rapidly exploding, even over the past year or two, more and more people are on that platform, on using that medium for whether it be entertainment or new learning, professional development. And so really meeting your audience where they're hanging out. So convenience is one of them. I mentioned earlier about growing your brand, growing your platform. Also on, with all of us in the speaking industry, is staying in touch with your audience before the keynote and after the keynote. It really allows you to kind of connect with them on a kind of a multimodal approach rather than just on stage. You're able to share episodes out. Maybe it's not in a price tag on it, but more so value add to
Hmm.
the conversation around getting booked as a speaker. A couple of other things, positioning yourself as an authority in the industry. So aside from the content that you already share out on social, this is just another kind of element that you can add to your toolkit, that you can add to your social media posting, and really building your network as well. So many podcast episodes, podcast shows is built around interviewing, and so being able to not only interview those in your network, but also expand out and be able to grow it that way. On the bad reasons side of things, there's a number of really bad reasons to start a podcast. But first off, probably the most obvious one is because you want to get rich. There's it's the long game for sure. You can make money on it for sure. There are revenue opportunities,
Yeah.
but if you're trying to just get in and out and make a quick buck, podcasting is not the right thing for you. Couple of other things. If you think it's easy, of course, it may come easy to some people, but for most, it does take some really solid effort and focus and a methodical, structured approach to really do it right. Of course, you could just have a computer and a microphone and kind of fire up a podcast. But if you think it's going to be an easy road to kind of grow an audience to have a successful show, that's kind of a bad reason to get into podcasting.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like professional speaking. We see that there. Like, people just say, "Oh, well, I was able to talk, at my company meeting," and they don't realize what it takes to, they're like, "I'm sure I can get paid $50,000 to give a keynote and
Right.
speak 4 times a week." That just that there's a longer road to that, and obviously an understanding of the craft that needs to happen. No different than playing an instrument at a great level, or singing, or acting, or anything else. And I would imagine, and we know that podcasting's turned out to be the same thing. The great podcasters have put they've done the reps, they put the effort and energy into just being great at that particular medium. So yeah.
Absolutely.
So you've seen a lot of people start podcasts. What do you see them, what mistakes do you see? What do you see them get wrong from time to time?
Yeah, kind of riffing off the bad reasons. It really comes down to kind of misunderstanding or underestimating the commitment that it
Mm,
takes. I just love this stat: 75% of podcasts fizzle out before their seventh episode. And it really comes down to they jumped in without a plan.
mm,
They thought they could just kind of start their show and figure it out as they go. Where yeah, you can do that, and you're going to hobble along, and it's going to be a bumpy road. But I kind of see people, not all for sure, but there's some amazing shows out there that we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation. But just kind of underestimating that. The second one is looking at a focused yet scalable kind of show theme, a show topic. A lot of people might get into podcasting and really say, "Oh, I have a great topic," and it turns out to be way too niche, where it's not scalable over time. Where maybe you could have 50 episodes on it, but you might not be able to have 500 episodes on it. And in podcasting, it's all about the long game. And so looking at how you can come up with a show theme that's broad enough
mhm.
that you're able to scale it and keep it consistent over time, but also being able to kind of lock in a particular niche that's unique to you and that
Mm.
isn't already being done.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I hear a lot about conversations around show format. Like, people ask, what is the best format, and should they borrow another one or come up with something unique? Do you have any thoughts on that, or any recommendations on show format?
Yeah, so there's dozens and dozens of different show formats out there,
Mhm.
and really, you can get as creative as you'd like to get as it relates to show format. But there are a couple, not standard, but more popular ones that you'll see if you're just kind of browsing Spotify podcasts. You'll come across many of these. So first off, probably the most popular is the interview format, where there's a single host. You have guests on the show. Maybe you have one guest or two guests, but essentially it revolves around an interview.
Mm.
The second one, probably the second most common one, is a monologue format. So again, this is a single host, but is more so kind of around a particular topic where there's no guests, but more so kind of a kind of a one-to-one conversation between the host and the listener.
Got it.
Next up, co-hosted, so you could have more than one host on the show. There's quite a few really successful shows out there that have kind of a co-hosted. You could also have guests on the show with that, but really kind of looking at your core competency, your skill set. Maybe you need a co-host to keep the
Right.
conversation going with someone to riff off of,
Hmm.
throughout the episode. A couple of other ones, less popular but still out there. Panel, so you might have kind of a moderator as well as three or four other kind of co-hosts on the show that kick around ideas. They kind of show different opinions and different angles of a particular topic, and kind of creates a cool format similar to kind of a live panel discussion at a conference. There's also storytelling. You'll see some sci-fi storytelling shows out there, which are kind of cool. And then there's this whole other category. that really digs into, pretty much the sky is the limit here, where you can mix and match interview and monologue and all these kind of different cool kind of categories combined together. But at the end of the day, it really kind of comes down to what are you going to be most comfortable with.
Mm,
And I know all of you, speak on stage, so you're totally comfortable, kind of speaking on your own. But podcasting is a slightly different format. You're still speaking, but it's much more intimate. It's much more conversational. It's much more in depth. So of course, I would recommend that you check out a bunch of shows, see which one is kind of resonating with you most, and then go from there.
great, great. And if someone's thinking about starting a podcast, do they need like a pre-existing audience of people that they're normally in communication with, whether it's through traditional marketing channels or social or clients or what have you?
Yeah, so obviously it's ideal if you have an existing audience, but
Sure.
it's for sure not required. At the end of the day, everyone's starting their show from scratch, and it's really going to come down to the commitment that you have around marketing and promoting the show. And so, as creative as you can possibly get to get the show out there, to get it in front of your social media followers, to share it from the stage at keynotes, to other creative tactics to get it going, you're just kind of in line with anyone else starting their show from scratch. Of course, having an existing audience, get them to kind of cross activate over the podcast platform is going to be a little bit easier from starting from scratch, but totally not required.
Nice. And I know there's a lot of different options when starting a podcast, a lot of different choices. Are there like a couple elements that you just can't miss? You have to have them. Like it's just a non-starter if you don't.
Yeah. So if I had to pick kind of two different elements, I'll give a tactical one and then a marketing side of one,
Okay, great.
that you just couldn't live without, or at least in my mind, you couldn't live without. The first one on the tactical side, as it relates to how you actually craft your episodes, is having a hook at the very beginning of every episode. Of course, majority of your new listeners are
Mm,
going to come from word of mouth. But for those organic ones that someone just kind of happens upon your show, you're going to have a very short window to activate them and bring them in as a subscriber or a listener. And so to have a very compelling hook up front is going to be super key. There's tons of ways that you can do that. Maybe it's a very cool show opener. Maybe it's a tease where
mm,
you draw out a particular quote or a particular short story from later on in the episode to kind of draw them in, foreshadow what's to come. But I would say you can't do without a really compelling hook. Second, on the marketing side, I would say a show website. And
mm.
this kind of gets back to, if you're starting from scratch, maybe you don't have an audience, maybe you have a small audience, is you're going to want to give them a way to interact with the show above and beyond just listening to it on Spotify. And a show
Yeah.
website is going to allow you to kind of pool all of these really interesting and cool resources for your loyal fans. So that could include transcription, show notes,
Mm.
additional resources that you can't get anywhere else, and just a central hub for those loyal fans to continue to interact with it.
I see
So
like a video recording sometimes of of what the show looks
yeah,
like with in studio.
100%.
Yeah.
And so all those things could live there, whether it's, a video recording, maybe it's, additional bios on your guests,
Mm.
additional links for particular stories that you talked about in each unique episode. So show website and a hook, two things you can't live without.
Got it. It's so easy now in some regards to start a podcast. I don't know it's so easy to start a great podcast, but if you decide you want to start a podcast tomorrow, if you have a microphone and a computer and maybe a headset, it's basically all you need. Of course, that's a dangerous thing to just do without really planning it properly. Are there any like key danger traps, any things that everyone should just before they just jump in, even if they're going to go quickly, is there anything they should just make sure that they're aware of so they can avoid them?
Yeah, for sure. Three things. First one is
Really?
that the pod fading effect. Like I mentioned earlier, 75%
Mm,
of podcasts, fizzle out before
right.
their seventh episode. And so the key point here is consistency. If you're starting out, oh, I'm going to do one show and let's just see how it is, and then you take a 2 week sabbatical, you come back, oh, let's do another episode, then you start to post them every day, and then you take a month off. That lack of consistency is really going to hurt you. A big part of the podcast game is to kind of show your listeners that you're really dedicated to the show, that you're really there for them, to help them, to provide them with content that's going to either drive some professional development, maybe it's entertainment, but to show that you're there for the long term. Second one is audio quality. You had mentioned about, anyone with a laptop and a microphone can start a podcast for sure. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really, really noticeable if you don't take the time and put in the investment for the right equipment.
Yeah.
For sure, it doesn't have to be $100,000, broadcast studio by any means, but just getting the right equipment locked in before you get started is for sure going to pay off in the long run. And then third is this idea of a through line.
Mm.
So, back to kind of the planning of your show, looking at, what is the show going to be about? What's the core theme? This is exactly that. One of the danger traps is though, is locking in that theme and then getting into a podcast, into an episode, start recording. Maybe you have a guest on the show and not actually referencing back to the show theme itself.
Hmm.
And so it kind of dances around it, but there isn't really a direct tie back or direct connection back to that show theme, which again is just going to be noticeable by your listeners. And just keep in mind these three things. Of course, you can, you'll get better over time. So your first episode is going to be much different than your 50th episode
Sure.
as it relates to the audio quality, as it relates to your delivery as an interviewer or a guest host of it of the show. So kind of take those with a grain of salt, but those would be the three things that I would watch out for.
Got it. And if someone's starting a show, I could see in some ways it's like professional speaking also. It can be daunting. There's a lot of details, a lot of things in the weeds you got to manage and work through. Are there resources out there? Like what if someone wants to do this, but they don't want to go all alone? What approach might they take?
Yeah, so there's kind of two primary approaches that you could take. The first one is just getting help from someone or a firm that can do it all for you.
Hmm.
Of course, allowing you to double down on what you do best. Maybe it's the content, maybe it's you're amazing at interviewing,
Sure.
and allowing a production firm such as Motown Podcast Studios that we're building to take care of the rest. Everything from the show concept development to the audio engineering to the marketing and distribution. There's a lot of elements that go into it, and if you're not only passionate about it but don't have the time to do it, that is a great option to team up with someone that can do the entire thing for you. On the other side of it, if you kind of want to take a more DIY approach, there are tons of different platforms and resources out there for someone that's just looking for one specific element of the production process or the ongoing production
Mm.
process. So there's, if you look at Fiverr or Upwork, there's tons of freelancers out there that can, execute on a particular part of the show, whether it be ongoing audio engineering or, coming up with different music selections, things like that. If you want to kind of go down another rung, would be kind of platforms that you can pay a monthly subscription to. There's several platforms out there that specialize in audio engineering specifically. That's one of the biggest kind of elements that people like to kind of outsource as it relates to an ongoing podcast. Some platforms that an actual human will do it and they'll turn it around in 48 hours. Other platforms is AI based, so it'll actually kind of use an algorithm to edit the show for you. Again, you're kind of given and taken based on your investment that you're putting into it, but there's tons of platforms out there, both on the full kind of turnkey production side of things, as well as more of a DIY kind of pick and choose type deal.
Got it. Yeah. So speaking of platforms, right? I mean, I know there's so many. So I mean, just Stitcher and Apple Podcasts and Spotify, like you mentioned. So how does someone pick? Like which one's most efficient to use? Should they use more than one? What's your recommendation there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the world of podcasting, the second you dig in, you'll find that there are just a ton of different platforms offering these amazing things. And so, as it relates to kind of the one-off DIY, I need help with audio engineering, there's tons. But also as it relates to on the hosting side. And so when you're speaking of Spotify and Apple Podcasts and such, it really comes down to how can you most efficiently get your episodes out? How can
Mm.
you, kind of get your show out into the ether without having to go to each platform and publish? And so it really comes down to what are called hosting platforms. And these hosting platforms, essentially, kind of zooming out, allow you to store and also distribute each one of your podcast episodes. So there's a bunch out there. There's Buzzsprout, there's Castos, there's Captivate. All have really cool names. But one in particular that I really like is Simplecast,
Mm.
and one that we use for all of our our shows that allows you not only to store and distribute all of your your episodes, but also does things like, stores all of your analytics for each one of those platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. It also allows you to kind of create a very cool show website where you could
Mhm.
have those resources that we talked about earlier. And the list goes on and on. At the end of the day, it really comes down to what's going to work best for you. What kind of investment do you want to put in to some, a platform like Simplecast that's, $15 a month. There's other ones that are $100 a month. So it really comes down to, what stage are you at right now, and what type of kind of overview do you want?
Awesome. And it sounds like probably one of the most important decisions is, what's your topic or your theme of your show. But also, you mentioned all these different formats, interview styles, all these sorts of things, and that obviously is also very important. You could have a great topic and the wrong style, and it's just like they're just not gonna work together, or it's just wrong
Absolutely.
for the personality of the host,
Right.
or the audience. How does someone who's starting a podcast, figure out what the right style for them is?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've at Motown, we've done a lot of research on this, and what we found is that there is a direct correlation between your personality profile of the core characteristics, strengths, weaknesses,
Mm,
communication preferences, and your optimal interview style or your optimal on-air style. And so what we do at Motown is we give our clients a personality profile assessment that essentially it's a 60 question assessment that really digs into kind of the depths of their personality, which outputs this really cool kind of report that we're able to then connect it to specific tactics, to specific kind of characteristics that you should follow, or at least kind of try to embody as an on-air host
hmm.
on your podcast to have the most success. Other cool things that you can do with that personality profile is directly link it to other people, whether it's podcast hosts or famous people that are doing it at a really high level,
Mm.
whether it be on air, a podcast, or interviewing on as an anchor, or even in movies. There's a lot of things that you can learn from other people. And so it allows you to kind of study the craft via what other people are doing. At the end of the day, it really comes down just to practice. And so these tools are great, but it takes a little bit of time to fill into your perfect on-air style.
You mentioned Motown, which is you're referring to Motown Podcast Studio. Something I'll ask you about that in a couple of minutes, and
Yeah,
we'll
absolutely.
explain what that is. But so if someone's already publishing a podcast, maybe it's just their first episode. What can they do? What are some tips to help it make it more appealing to listeners to really get it from, okay, I got this thing started. Now, how do I get it to grow? How do I get that viewership or that listenership to just skyrocket?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, and it kind of comes back to that show website that we talked about, having a central location for all these resources that go above and beyond what the average show would have. Other things like you had mentioned, Jordan, about what if there was a video component to the show? Maybe it's a full recording of
Yeah.
the interview, or just the monologue episode. Maybe it's little snippets that you cut up into really compelling kind of show teasers that you either share out on your own social, share with guests that you have on the show, that just kind of really make it more of an experience rather than just a 45-minute conversation. Other things that you can do, of course, digging into how can you interact with the guests, how can you get them to not only share the episode, but how can you get them to interact above and beyond what you would expect from a guest interview. So a couple of things there.
Good, good. We love asking this question, and we ask it to speakers all the time, and probably many of you on this webinar, as we worked on things together. We say, most people think X, but the truth is Y. And I want to ask you the same thing, Connor, as it relates to podcasts. Most people think X, the truth is Y. What's an example or two of what those blanks filled in might look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I actually have two. So
Okay.
the first one is, most people think that podcasting is a fad. But the truth is, it's an exponentially exploding industry.
Mm.
Globally will do about $10 billion in market value for the year, which is absolutely insane. So at least in my mind, in my opinion, I think it's here to stay, which would go against some traditional thinking.
Right, it's rivaling at that. No, it's rivaling probably the global market. I mean, the U.S. market for speaking non-COVID times is a little more than 4 billion. So, I mean, that's worldwide. That's pretty impressive.
Absolutely. And then the second one that I might add is, most people think that, and again, this kind of riffs off what we were saying earlier. Most people think that you could just have a computer and a microphone to
Right.
start a podcast, which you can, but the truth is, to be successful, you have to have a methodical, structured approach that is planning for the long term rather than just trying to make a quick win.
Very cool. That's great. Um, Well, let me ask you this: what podcasts do you like? Obviously, I know that you're a big consumer of podcasts and have been just as a listener, but also you study the craft and you study the industry. Which ones excite you and why?
Yeah, so I'm like you said, I'm an avid listener of podcasts, and I like to enjoy, a really diverse mix of podcasts. But recently, I've been kind of on the business side of things. There's one that I really enjoy. It's called Startup, and it's a really cool. It has a really cool backstory. Alex Blumberg, who's now the CEO and founder of Gimlet Media, which was just acquired by Spotify for $200 million.
Right.
He actually started the podcast years ago to
Mhm.
document his kind of development of what is Gimlet today. And so the first season was all about the development of his business, and was actually used at one of the episodes was used as a pitch to Chris Sacca to try and fund his company. But now it's co-hosted. Now it's a little bit broader. It digs into kind of an overview of developing businesses in general. A couple of other ones that I like that's kind of in a different realm. One of them is Broken Record, that's hosted by Rick Rubin. Malcolm Gladwell is also on the show. Really has kind of a cool musical twist to it, which is really cool. Another one, Revisionist History, which is also Malcolm Gladwell. Just a really highly produced show. It's almost like a movie. It's almost like you're watching a movie on every episode, which is pretty cool. A couple of other ones, more so examples, just kind of give you a feel for what else is out there. There's one called Life After, and this one's by GE, which is actually a sci-fi storytelling podcast, which is really cool. It's something that you would not expect from a company like GE. It is a branded podcast, but it comes off as something that's very organic, which is cool. And then the last one I would say is McDonald's has a podcast. It's actually called The Sauce. Really cool kind of concept, which actually kind of airs out their dirty laundry, the things that they've done bad in the past,
That's great.
to create more of a loyal followership and a little bit more brand connection with their current customers.
Great. Well, I have one or two more questions for you, but I don't want to
Yeah,
go there yet. Let's pause for a second. I want to see if anybody on the webinar has some questions. I think there's a few things in the chat,
yeah, let's
which
check
we
it
can
out.
pull up here. It's interesting because normally we have when Connor's not on camera, he has to play the role of engineer and on camera. So feel free to add anything to chat or just go ahead and unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you want, and chime in and ask away. We got an expert with us today. So
Absolutely.
uh,
Steven Shapiro just launched mine yesterday.
nice.
Timing's perfect. Absolutely. Using Simplecast. Yeah. Glad you made the right decision for sure. There's just the functionality of it's really cool. I just love Simplecast because long term, again, podcasting is the long game. You can add shows to your accounts. You could have multiple shows. Really cool platform. Clint Greenleaf, like the soap operas of early TV era, for
Mhm.
sure. Absolutely. There's so many cool creative concepts out there in the podcast world. We're always finding new types of shows every day. It's just cool to be able to pick and choose different elements. Oh, that's a really interesting concept. Let's maybe add that to our run of show, kind of test it out. Scott Ostrom, is there a guide of recommended technical equipment like microphones? For sure, absolutely. But just kind of as a short answer here, and I'll actually have Matt from our team send out a full document after. As it relates to microphones, I would say kind of the perfect recommendation would be the Shure SM7B. That's what we're using in the studio here today. It does take a little bit of kind of a learning curve to it, but once you figure it out via YouTube video or whatnot, it just works. Has amazing audio. It's really nice. A little bit more on the user-friendly end, the Blue Yeti mic is pretty darn good. It does have a little bit of, it's not as great audio quality, but still works really darn well, especially if you're going to do some tweaking of that audio
And
file after you record.
and that allows, depending on which one you get, allows you to use USB, where
Yep.
the Shure mic is XLR. It's got to go into some kind of a box or board, and it's a little trickier. That Shure
Absolutely.
microphone's been around forever. I feel like it was around when I was a kid, and it's still the same thing, and it just continues. You watch every podcast, oh, not every, but the vast majority, you're like, there's that Shure mic, there's that Shure mic. Very cool.
Sure, the Blue Yeti is the USB one you recommend the most.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they have a couple different models. If you did want the XLR model, they do have that too. But yeah, really user friendly on the Yeti mic front.
Great. Any other questions? Anyone want to chime in or type them in? Go for it. Just like speakers, you gotta podcast hosts like to talk. So
I had one other question if I could chime in. Is there
yeah,
any
great, Scott, go for it.
any magic to creating a really kind of catchy, fun intro that has a certain level of production quality to it, or a place you can go to get something like that created for you?
Yeah, absolutely. On Fiverr, I mentioned earlier, Fiverr and Upwork, they have some really interesting resources there. There's actually people that specialize in podcast intros, which is pretty cool. But other aside from that, just kind of using your own creativity. Something that can really amp up a show intro is some really compelling music that may be slightly non-traditional from what you would expect. And so maybe you have a business show, but you integrate some techno music, or maybe you integrate some jazz music, or something that's unexpected, which is cool. Other ideas to kind of amp up your intro. Of course, you want to introduce yourself. You want to kind of foreshadow what's to come in the episode. You could also kind of have, if it's an interview show, you could bring in the voice of the interviewee to kind of give some intrigue. When you look at some of the more popular shows out there, Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss, they usually put their 5-10 minutes of ads up front, which is great because they can do that now. But when first starting out, I would use that time to really drive value for the listener, really try to not solve the pain point, but hit on the pain point that your target listener is going to have, that you kind of mapped out in your listener profiles.
Thank you.
Good.
No problem.
Well, I have another question for you, Connor,
Yeah.
and if there's none other, we'll kind of bring it home with this. So you mentioned before, Motown Podcast Studios. It's something we've been working on for a while here. Can you share with everyone, what that is and what it's about, and how potentially we can help if people are interested?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little backstory on how we came up with Motown Podcast Studios and the whole vibe of the company. So back in 1960, Berry Gordy, he was the creator, founder of Motown Records, and obviously majority of probably know him. He's a jazz legend. He's a production record great, and he wasn't successful just because he was really good at discovering great artists, but more so that he had a systematic approach, a step-by-step methodical system that he put into action for every single artist that came in his door. And so with that, we've taken and are leveraging similar systems, similar methodologies and structures, but applying them to podcasts. And so, kind of zooming out to, a high level description of Motown, it's a full service production firm for podcasting, everything from, show concept to marketing, to coming up with your cover art, to distribution, reaching out to podcast networks, everything in between. But also on the other side, we also work with clients that again are looking for that DIY model. They're just looking for someone, a partner to work on audio engineering, or just someone to help them out with their design. So we really rely on our systematic approach. It's something that we've been developing over the past couple of years now, and something that we're really excited about to share, not only with speakers but the world at large. So yeah, that's kind of a description of it.
Good. And I think with podcasting, like anything, I mean, we're always happy to, if you want to work with us and use one of our services, fantastic. We love that. But feel free to call or email with a question. We're always happy to jump on, have conversations, jump on a call and kind of talk through. If you're thinking about starting, you're not sure, we'll give you straight, honest feedback and advice and our opinion of whether or not that, that kind of makes sense for your business based on what you've shared with us. So that always is free. We're always friends on all these related topics, whatever it is. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? All right. Well, we like always, we'll send out that resource that Connor mentioned. We will put this up on YouTube. So if you want to share it with anybody, or if for those that are, most people don't watch this live, they end up watching it later. So that'll be up there. Matt will send that out. And with that, it's great to see everybody, and we will see you back here next month with another 3 Ring Circus Bootcamp webinar.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.